Hi, everyone. I don't know if it sounds like the microphone's working. It is. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. For those who don't know, I'm Carolyn Wilkins. I'm a senior research scholar at the Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies. And, thanks a lot for coming this afternoon. We have something fantastic in store. As you know, a discussion of Professor Leah Boustan's latest book called Streets of Gold, America's Untold Story of Immigrant Success. And I'll just talk a little bit about Professor Boustan right now. See if she blushes. She's a professor of economics here at Princeton and a director of industrial relations section. She's also the co-director of the development of the American Economy program at the NBER, among many other professional engagements. And if you look at her webpage, you're going to see that her research lies at the intersection between economic history and labor economics. And she's got many accomplishments, pretty impressive. Her first book is entitled Competition in the Promised Land. It examines the effect of the Great Black migration from rural South to during and after World War II. She's written for the New York Times, the American Prospect, and Slate. Leah was named an Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellow in 2012, and she was awarded the Isa Young Labor Economist Award in 2019. She's joined today by Matthew Yglesias, who's here. He said that I shouldn't say too much about him, but I'm not going to listen to him. He's a blogger and a journalist, as many of you know. He writes about economics and politics, and he's the editor of the newsletter and blog called Slow Boring. He's a co-founder of Vox.com. It's pretty cool. Prior to launching Vox, he was the author of a column for Slate that was called Moneybag, which I think is really a title. And he blogged for Think Progress, The Atlantic, and The American Prospect. He's also the author of several books, so this is going to make for a great conversation. Most recently, his most recent book is called 1 Billion Americans, The Case for Thinking Bigger. So the format is that Leah's going to first give us some introductory remarks, and then Leah and Matt are going to sit down for a really lively interview-style discussion. So over to you.
Thanks to everyone for being here. I'm just so delighted to be able to share some of the findings from my new book, Streets of Gold, here on my home turf at Princeton University. Thank you to Carolyn for the introduction, and to Steve Redding and Ilyana Kuzyenko for inviting me here through the Griswold Center, to Dana Molina for conceptualizing the event and organizing it, and of course to Matt for coming up from DC for this important conversation. So I wrote this book with my longtime collaborator, Ron Abramitsky, who's at Stanford. And we were inspired to write this book because we believe that our national conversations about immigration have been driven largely by myths rather than by facts and data. And one of these myths inspired our title, the myth of Streets of Gold, the idea that America has streets of gold and anyone can come here and quickly improve their lot in life. But the truth is a lot more complex. So think about this quotation that is painted on the wall of the Ellis Island Museum. It is attributed to an unknown Italian immigrant. And he said, "I came to America because I heard that the streets were paved with gold. But when I got here, I found out three things. First, the streets were not paved with gold. Second, they weren't paved at all. And third, I was expected to pave them." So what would happen to our understanding of American history if we listened to the millions of unsung immigrants like this unnamed immigrant here? And that is our aim in the book. We use data on millions of immigrant families to rebuild the story of immigration from the ground up. So where do these findings come from? We build large data sets for the past and the present, following immigrant families over time. We can follow an immigrant as he arrives and spends more time in the country. We can also follow the children of immigrants who we see living at home with their parents and can follow into adulthood. In the past, we do this using historical census data, and I'm illustrating one of these census manuscripts here. You can think of us like curious grandchildren who are following their own family members on genealogy websites like Ancestry.com. Has anyone here used Ancestry to look up their family members? A few people. So I did that, and we started browsing around on Ancestry at the beginning of our research project. And then we developed methods to automate those searches and then algorithms to link individuals over time. And I'm giving you one example of an immigrant family here, not at all selected at random. This is my own grandfather, Matthew Platt, living in Chicago in 1920 when he was 7 years old. He's the child of immigrants. He's living with his parents and his 7 brothers and sisters. And as it turns out, my family is very representative of the story that we find in the big data. My great-grandfather moved to the US in 1891, and he never moved up the economic ladder. But his children did. His children moved into clerical positions in offices. They became salespeople in retail stores. And then his youngest 2 children, my grandfather and his younger brother, became a doctor and a lawyer. And this is indeed the pattern that we see in the larger data. The first generation moves up slowly, if at all, and the second generation rises. This is true for the Ellis Island generation. It's also true for today. So I only have a few minutes before I turn to the conversation with Matt, which will be much more interesting. But I wanted to take just 5 minutes to reassess 3 immigration myths. Is it really true that there's an unprecedented flood of immigration today? And the answer is no. Did the Ellis Island generation rise quickly from rags to riches? And again, the answer is no. And finally, are immigrant families and their children today stuck in a permanent underclass? And the answer is no. So let's go over these one by one. If you ask Americans on surveys, they'll tell you that immigrants make up a larger share of the population than ever before. But they are totally wrong. Immigrants now account for 14% of the US population, the same percentage as was true a century ago and for over 50 years. In between these 2 periods, you notice this immigration valley. This was policy-driven. In the 1920s, the US imposed restrictive immigration quotas, and we see the share of the population born abroad bottoming out in 1970 at 4%. So we wanted to compare immigrant success in these 2 waves: recent immigrants and immigrants during the Ellis Island period. So let's turn to Ellis Island. We have a nostalgic view about immigrants during this period. But did these immigrants really arrive penniless? And if so, were they able to move from rags to riches? The story is wrong in 2 different ways, so it's interesting. What we're looking at here is a comparison of the earnings of immigrants by their country of origin. These are immigrants who arrived in the US around the year 1900. And they came from a variety of European countries that you can see listed on the bottom of the picture. If they earned the same amount as the US born, they would be at the 0 line. And you can see that a lot of the countries of origin already are earning more than the US born, even when they first arrive in the country. Those are the black bars that tell you the earnings for someone who've been in the country for less than 5 years. Then we follow those people. And the white bars tell you how well these immigrants are doing after 30 years in the country. Some countries of origin already are earning more than the US born when they first arrive. So many European migrants 100 years ago did not arrive in rags. They already arrived from countries that were at parity with the US in terms of level of development, and they brought with them job skills, wealth, and education. But for those countries where immigrants did arrive and earn less than the US born, while there is some upward mobility, if you compare the black bars to the white bars, there's not perfect convergence in a lifetime. The same thing is true for today. Today, you'll see in maybe the next slide, there are more immigrants coming from poor countries. So more immigrants would be on the left-hand side of this picture. But the upward mobility, the pace of change is very similar today. Okay, so let's turn to that now. And I want to mention that, of course, our findings don't stop in one generation. Immigrant families are indeed highly mobile, but it takes until the second generation for that mobility to really manifest. So I will show you this now for the modern data. So here, again, very similar type of picture where we're looking at immigrants by country of origin. The black dots are telling us about first-generation immigrants who themselves came to the country, and we're looking at a variety of different countries of origin. So again, there's some countries of origin where immigrants are already earning more than the US born soon after they arrive. But there's also a lot of countries where immigrants are earning less. And those are the dots that are below the zero line. But now look at the red dots. The red dots are children of immigrants. These are people in the surveys who say, my parents came from one of these countries of origin. And for the children of immigrants, in almost every case, those children have reached the zero line or even gone above, meaning that they earn as much, if not more, than the US born of the same age. There are a few countries where the children have moved up but have not reached parity. But in all cases, the children are moving up. So what happens then if we compare children of immigrants to the children of the US born who were raised at the same point in the income distribution? Clearly, from the picture I just showed you, many children of immigrants are raised in poorer families. What I'll show you today is going to focus in on children who are raised at the 25th percentile of the income distribution, which is roughly like having 2 working parents with full-time minimum wage jobs. But the patterns are very similar if we look at other points in the income distribution too. And what we're going to find is that children of immigrants are able to move up faster than children of the US born raised at the same point in the distribution. So this is the data for today. And it's a bit small. It's hard to see all the numbers, but on the very bottom of the picture, you can see the income percentile that these children achieve on average when they themselves go into the labor market. So remember, they're all raised at the 25th percentile. Look at the purple dot that's on the left-hand side of the picture. That reflects the children of white US-born parents. They achieve the 46th percentile in their own adulthood. But now look at all of the orange dots that are to the right of that purple dot. Those reflect a whole variety of different countries of origin for these children's parents. And in almost every case, the children of immigrants are able to move up more rapidly than the children of US-born parents raised at the same income percentile. I just wanted to box here for you a set of countries that are very much in the news today. These are countries from Central America, poor countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, that are very much part of our current conversation about the southern border. And we see that children raised at the 25th percentile, whose parents come from these countries, are achieving, on average, the 53rd percentile in their own adulthood. So you can see very similar patterns if you look at the Ellis Island period. This is now, on the left-hand side, boys who were living at home in 1880. On the right-hand side, boys who were living at home in 1910 and are observed in the labor market in 1940. Again, looking at kids who were raised at the 25th percentile, those who were raised by US-born parents are moving up, but those who were raised by parents of those whose parents were immigrants are moving up even more. And so achieving on average the 50th percentile. So this pattern is very common across time, and I'm sure we will have a chance to talk in our conversation with Matt about why this happens. What are the special advantages that the children of immigrants experience? So I want to conclude by asking about immigration reform. From our work, we learn that the American dream is just as alive now as it was 100 years ago, that the children of immigrants rise to the same degree now as in the storied Ellis Island period. Yet, our immigration system is in gridlock and has not been updated since 1990, around 30 years. Is there any hope for reform? Well, first, there is a silent majority in favor of immigration. In the latest Gallup poll, 75% of the country said that immigration was good for the nation. But of course, there is real and growing political polarization on this issue. So the last thing I want to mention is that we take heart in a moment in US history when attitudes towards immigration changed very rapidly in a single generation, and at a moment when strong politicians took action to change the national conversation about immigration. It happened in the past, and we think it can happen again. So this is what I mean. We went back to the congressional record, and we collected all of the speeches that have ever been given about immigration since 1880. That's 200,000 speeches. And then we classified them as pro or anti-immigration. And what we're graphing here is the share of speeches that are pro minus the share of speeches that are anti. So when this number is below the zero line, it means that more speeches are anti-immigration than pro-immigration. And notice that from 1880 to 1945, speeches about immigration were consistently negative. For both parties, across time, people did not like immigrants from 1880 to 1940, and indeed, Congress tried to restrict the border 4 times before they were successful in the 1920s. But then take a look at the period from 1950 to 1965. This series shifts from uniformly negative to positive in a 15-year period. Today, on average, speeches about immigration are positive still now, but of course you see the growing polarization by party. What happened in that 15-year period? This was a conscious effort on the part of Presidents Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson to change our conversation, introducing the idea of a nation of immigrants, introducing the idea that the Statue of Liberty should be a representation of our country. Why? Well, they were embroiled in Cold War politics. The Soviet Union was engaged in propaganda saying that our immigration system was racist and was targeted against particular countries of origin. In order to change that system, the presidents thought that the country needed to change their attitudes about immigration, and they were effective in being able to affect that change. So we think that's happened before. We think it can happen again. So there's much more to talk about in our conversation, much more that's in the book. We have some data on the cultural assimilation of immigrants. Immigrants take active steps to become Americans now just as much as in the past. We have special data on refugees. Refugees assimilate quite well. A discussion of whether immigrant success is coming at the expense of the US born. And of course, the stories of many immigrant families from oral histories and from a survey that we conducted, including the story of some of our favorite economists whose families come from all around the world. So I'm looking forward to the conversation with Matt and to questions from all of you.
Yeah, so I figure we'll chat for a little bit and then, do some questions later. Thank you so much for that presentation. This is really fascinating book. I think, the sort of most obvious to me question left by the presentation is, it almost seems like too good to be true. Why would poor immigrants be so much more successful at that? It's interesting, and it seems like we could maybe a lot about this.
So we know a lot more about the answer to that question from our historical data than we know for today. I'll just start with that caveat. For the historical data, we have individual records for millions of people. One theory that people often raised to us is that immigrants care more about education. At least in the past, we see no evidence of this. If anything, it's the opposite. If you're looking at children of immigrants who were raised at the same point in the income distribution, they actually held less education than children of the US born by almost a year. So what could be going on is like what happened in my family, where the 7th and 8th brothers were able to go to college and then into the professions, but their older siblings had to leave school early in order to help provide for the family. So I don't mean to say that it's really the values of immigrants being expressed there, but we don't see that the children of immigrants in the past had more schooling. And in fact, Matt and I have talked a little bit about this for the modern period, that in fact you would think it would be a disadvantage in the education system today to have foreign-born parents who might not be able to help with you with your homework, who may not understand how to help you get into college and fill out your applications and that sort of thing. So what's left? What we found in the data was really startling to us. In the past, there's such a strong role for geography. Immigrants just avoided the low mobility locations. So for example, the US South. The US South was highly agricultural, primarily cotton growing, and was not a good place for upward mobility for anyone, Black Americans or white Americans. At the time that the country was 14% foreign-born, the South was 2% foreign-born. So that's just one regional example, but even if you get within regions, immigrants were moving to the dynamic cities. And so today we see evidence of this as well, that geography matters. So geography doesn't explain everything today. The reason why we can't do more on the modern data yet is because I didn't really go into this, but the modern data is incredible. It comes from our tax system, from the IRS data, from Opportunity Insights Lab. But we get it in aggregate form. So we know how the children of immigrants from different countries of origin who were raised at different points in the income distribution are faring. But we don't know any of the other information about them on an individual basis. We don't know where they live. We don't know their education level. Someone knows that. That data is it's extant, but it's not something that other researchers can use. So we're going to continue to work on what might explain the modern pattern. Just because we find such similar degrees of upward mobility in past and present doesn't mean that the mechanisms.
And so, but in terms of the geographic mobility from the past, this is essentially native-born people are sort of torn between, well, there's objectively opportunity here, but also I have ties to my community, whereas an immigrant, almost by definition, is someone who's decided, they're trying to move for opportunity, so you go to where that opportunity is.
Well, that's exactly right. Imagine we changed the basis of comparison and we said, let's only take US-born people who've moved and compare them to the foreign-born who we know that they've moved because they were born in another country. So we can look at that in terms of people who have a certain state of birth and now they're in a different state of residence. And the children of those internal migrants actually do very well, and not quite as well as children of immigrants, but they make up a lot of the gap. Mm-hmm. So a lot of it has to do with you kind of revealing your willingness to leave home in order to seek opportunity, which isn't to say that there aren't, real pulls on people's decisions about where to locate. It could be family ties, it could be friends and social networks, it could be a sense of place, and those might provide tremendous value to someone's life. But when we're looking only at an outcome like earnings, that's not.
So when you compare the historical to the modern day, one area where I do think there is a difference is that the income gap between countries of origin and the contemporary United States is larger now, right? Because essentially today's poor countries are about as poor as the poor countries of 100 years ago, but the United States is much wealthier.
That's right. So if we think about the immigrants from 100 years ago, they come from European countries, Almost all of them were in the top 30 countries in the world in terms of GDP per capita. Today, most of our biggest sending countries are ranked around 90th or 100th in the world in GDP. But we're pulling immigrants today from substantially poorer countries, and those income gaps relative to the US are much larger. Countervailing that is the selection of who from within those countries moves. So it used to be that the Statue of Liberty was correct, that give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. The statute doesn't mean globally, but the statute was intended to say within European society that immigrants would be coming from the lower end of the socioeconomic distribution in Europe. So that's true. So we had, in the past, immigrants from relatively rich countries, but it tended to be from the lower end of the income distribution. Now, the US is pulling immigrants from poorer countries, but they tend to be among the most educated and the wealthiest. And I'm not only referring to immigrants who have BAs on average, PhDs. There are some countries like India where 77% of immigrants to the US have a BA. I'm also referring to immigrants who you might encounter and think, oh, this is a relatively low educated person in the US context. But relative to their home country, they tend to be drawn from the upper middle part or the top of the educational.
And is that true even for undocumented immigrants and asylum-seeking immigrants, or is it a feature of the visa selections?
Well, that is hard to say because the data that this comes from doesn't have information on legal status.
Right.
What is true is that pattern holds for almost every country around the world. And the one location where it doesn't hold, which is quite interesting, is Puerto Rico. So I say location rather than country because, of course, Puerto Rico is not a separate country. And because of that, Puerto Ricans do not face barriers for in and out migration. And from that particular location, those immigrants tend to be either they look like the average or even maybe somewhat lower skilled than average from the island. So I think that's pretty instructive, that if you face no barriers at all, maybe we would not have such positive selection, meaning such educated immigrant inflow. And some of that probably has to do with how to figure out the immigration system, either how to figure out how to enter in an undocumented fashion, maybe overstaying a visa, or how to enter and get legal services.
And when you look at, you showed the chart, and there's quite a bit of variation from country to country. And, at first you might think, well, so one of your charts just showed, okay, immigrants from this country as a whole, and you say, well, okay, those were maybe wealthier people came from England versus came. But when you look at the contemporary data, you showed us a chart specifically of 25th percentile households. So why is it that, immigrants from China and India do so much better on that chart than from other parts of the world?
Right, so this was the chart that I flashed with the one purple dot and then the 45 peach-colored dots where almost every country of origin had children that were doing better. But there was a lot of dispersion among those countries. I mean, I was really emphasizing the average, but there were some cases where the children are raised at the 25th percentile and the kids are reaching the 60th or 65th percentile in adulthood, which is really spectacular. If you look down that chart, it will tend to go in regional groups. So at the very top of the chart was children of immigrants from Asia. It was India and China, but also Vietnam, also Pakistan. If you then move below that, children of immigrants from Europe, Yugoslavia, Greece, etc. And then South America, Central America, and then just sort of a mixture in between. At the very bottom of the chart were sons of immigrants from the Caribbean. The picture for daughters is different there. So Matt was asking about children whose parents came from Asia. And, again, we don't have the ability to really delve into the modern data with all the precision that we would get from individual microdata. But we suspect that, well, there's certainly a number of hypotheses that are worthy of test that we could work on or other people could work on. One is this idea of underplacement. So what we're looking at for the parents' income is an average of 7 to 10 years of earnings. So it's not like these are grad students who are at the 25th percentile, but then they're going to necessarily immediately rise. It is a long average for the parents. But it could be that Asian immigrants who end up at the 25th percentile working as housekeepers or restaurant workers, childcare workers, actually arrived already with some form of higher degree, but they're not able to work in their chosen field.
They don't have a credential, or maybe they don't speak
English, don't have a credential, right, exactly. But they may be able to pass on to their children more than just income. They might be able to pass on certain educational. So that's something that needs to be tested. Another idea that actually Noah Smith brought up is that it could matter not only about your own parents' education or income level, but also about the education or income level of your community. So this might go back to the George Borjas idea of ethnic capital, but let's say your parents are dishwashers in a restaurant, but you go to the Chinese Cultural Center, and at the Chinese Cultural Center, there's the children of PhDs. That could matter too, even if your own parents are not necessarily underplaced.
Makes a lot of sense, actually, now that I think about it. That's really interesting. So, in terms of the politics, I think it's good to stay optimistic. But I was also, watching the news today where Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis have come up with this stunt of kind of busing or flying asylum seekers into blue states. Some of them were going off in front of Kamala Harris's house, some to Martha's Vineyard. And the thing that conservatives were telling me about was like, yes, it's a stunt. But what we're showing here is that the liberals who are expressing positive views about immigration, they are virtue signaling. And that when faced with the actual dilemmas of needing to find housing and employment and medical care and social services for all of these people, they themselves come crying and saying, oh, no, we need help. Oh, you're so terrible for bringing them here. And that this support for immigration is basically an illusion that, is now going to be punctured. And I wonder what you think about that. I mean, how real is it? When faced with the kind of practical problems of an influx of people?
I saw that reaction too, and I immediately wondered if you were to just create a scatter plot of the share of a local area that voted Democratic and the share immigrant in the area, wouldn't that relationship be positive? Aren't there many immigrants in places where people are voting blue? So the idea behind that stunt is like, oh, you don't have to face immigration, you're shielded from it, but if we put a few immigrants in your lap, then you'll see what we're really dealing with. And I actually don't think that that fits with where most immigrants live. And I think many people who vote for Democrats have had many experiences with immigrants in their daily lives, at their workplace, at their schools. And the second thing is, like you said, it's a stunt. It plays well on Twitter. But we have to remember the 75% of Americans who say that immigration is good for the country. When they see this stunt, many of them are really turned off. And so if you're engaging in politics for likes and clicks from your base, then that really pushes you to the extreme. But here we are in a situation where we've never had more positive attitudes towards immigrants. So when you look at how there's been polarization, and Republican speeches are more negative about immigration now than they used to be, they're back down to what the average speech looked like in 1900. What's different about today is we also have those positive speeches that didn't used to exist. We now have a whole set of coalitions that are pro-immigration, and I don't think that this kind of stunt is going to be very popular.
Then the other sort of critique from the right that I wanted to bring up here is something that I know I've heard Stephen Miller say and other people say is, well, look, part of why this earlier wave of immigration worked out well is that we did the cutoff, he calls it a pause, starting in the 1920s, and that created the circumstances under which children of immigrants assimilated. There was, demand for labor, et cetera, et cetera. And so all this goes to show is that we need to sort of like run the cycle.
Well, I think that's where the data and facts come in. We weren't sure what we were going to find when we tried to compare the children of immigrants today to the children of immigrants in the past. And there's a variety of hypotheses under which the children of immigrants today would not have been doing as well. The Stephen Miller hypothesis is one of them, that somehow the Italians and the Jews were benefited by the border closure. Another hypothesis is what you might hear from some folks on the right, that the immigrants today are in some ways not as good. They're coming from poorer countries and their kids won't be able to make it. And then another hypothesis comes from the left, that immigrants today are more likely to be non-white, they'll face barriers and discrimination, and that's why their kids won't get ahead. So there's a number of hypotheses that we had in our minds when we looked at the data, but the data says something very different. That even though the circumstances today are different in so many ways, the countries of origin are different, the economic conditions are different, it looks like you could just lay those two graphs right on top of each other, and the children of immigrants are doing just as well now as they did in the past.
And that's why I do think where you started with the sort of the myth of the streets of gold is important context for all this work, because it seems like one reason that people are unduly pessimistic about contemporary immigration is that they maybe have a misrecollection or an excessively rosy view what the past was like, because you look around and it's obviously true. There's lots of foreign-born people who are struggling economically. Their kids do better, but they don't, they're not amazing. They're not superheroes or whatever. And part of the point is just to understand that that's how it has always been. That if you come here and you don't speak English, you're going to have a hard time, and that then your children do better. And why do you think it is that we kind of have this misrepresentation of what the past was?
Well, I'll tell you the day that Ron and I decided we wanted to write the book. I don't know if you remember when President Trump said, I wish we had more immigrants from Norway instead of the immigrants that we have now. And it was funny because some of our early work had been on immigrants from Norway, because Norway keeps such amazing records. And so the data was there, so we could use that case. And we knew that actually the Norwegian immigrants were earning almost the least of any immigrant group. They were moving up the slowest, and their children were also moving up relatively slowly because of geography, because they were located in more rural farm areas in the upper Midwest. So this is when we realized that there's something that we can contribute to the public debate by having the long-run perspective. So we saw that when it comes to being positive about the Ellis Island generation, even President Trump, even Rush Limbaugh were quite laudatory about immigrants from that period. And they said things that were not that different from what President Obama would say when he would go in front of like an Italian-American organization on Columbus Day and said these nice things about how Italians had built the country. Where they differed was in their understanding of how relevant that analogy was for today. Is Ellis Island going to be replicated with immigrants today? Or is Ellis Island some golden age that we have to pine for? And that's where the left and the right were diverging. And so we were just at that time looking at brand new off the presses graphs, the ones that I showed you today with all of those orange dots. And we said, well, we have something that we can add to the conversation. I think as to why this rosy view of the past has emerged, it's understandable. It's hard to remember 100 years ago. But when I think about my family, I don't think about my great-grandfather, someone who I never met. I think about my grandfather, and he was already a doctor. He was doing pretty well. So we remember people from around 3 generations back, many of whom were children of immigrants, not the immigrants themselves. We forget that immigrants from a variety of European countries never learned English. We forget that they were working as peddlers, they were working in the garment industry, they were working on the docks, they were farm workers, and they proceeded with those occupations throughout their lifetime. So now when we see an immigrant from Guatemala who arrived in the country 20 years ago, we think, oh, that's the end of the story. But that's really just the beginning of it.
And this is true on the sort of cultural level too, right? I mean, you have research in the book about names and other things that people do to facilitate cultural assimilation, and also, those of us who have looked into the past know there used to be this incredible like Yiddish language press because people were not learning. It's hard to learn foreign languages as an adult, and people today and people in the past like couldn't necessarily do it, but their children do because it's very easy for children to learn language, right? And that's just a fundamental fact. Works.
Right, we tried to get as many data points as we could on cultural assimilation. Because when we told people our findings on economics, they, let's say we're in an airplane and unfortunately the person next to you starts talking to you and asks you what you're doing, then I would explain and they'd say, well, but immigrants these days, like they don't learn English, they live in immigrant neighborhoods, they don't really want to become American, whereas my grandfather, blah, blah, blah. So that's what we wanted to look into as well. And so what we're able to see in the data are things like, do you speak English? It's a very coarse measure. It's just sort of a yes, no. What neighborhood are you living in? Are you living in a neighborhood surrounded by other immigrants or in a more integrated neighborhood? Who do you marry? So if you arrived unmarried, do you always marry someone from the home country, or do you marry someone from another country or from the US? And then our favorite measure, inspired by Ron's own family, are the names that immigrants give to their children. And on all of those measures, we find that immigrants today are making strides towards becoming American at the same pace as immigrants.
I think we're going to open this up to some questions from people in the audience. I think we've got a couple of microphones down here if you want to come down the aisle. Just walk down and line up, but please make them real questions, or I'll throw this at you, and then we don't want us trouble. So just behave yourselves.
I just want to thank you, Matt, for this really interesting conversation. I know I stole some of your thunder by presenting some of the work, but you came up with such interesting angles, so I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, and let's hear. Hmm.
Well, notice that when I was talking about the past and the present, I talked about children who were living at home in 1910, and then I talked about children who were living at home in the 1980s. What about the middle? What about children who were living at home in 1940 or 50? Well, it turns out that there's just very few immigrants that would fit that description, and that's because of the immigration valley that we saw when we looked at the long-run time series. There are a very, very few number of immigrants that were able to enter the country in the 40s and 50s. Some of them were scientists fleeing from Nazi regime. Then there were a few displaced persons after the war.
War brides? Is that another? Like wives of American service members?
Wives of service members. And then in 1953, there was a Refugee Relief Act for people fleeing communism. There were some kids who were allowed to come from Cuba, etc. But we're talking about such small numbers. There's really a whole lost generation there. And that's really how it figures in. It figures in by being missing.
So you're left with these kind of extraordinary cases.
Yeah.
Earlier when you were presenting your book, you showed a chart which told us that immigrants from different nationalities, what were their income when they first arrived in their first 5 years or so, and where they were maybe 30 years on. And one nationality that really jumped out to me was Finland. And I was curious, do you know what happened there? How come Finland was the one huge outlier where 30 years on, somehow the income actually
Worse than ever, yeah.
Yeah, worse
fell
than ever.
really, really
Yeah,
hard
yeah.
relative to everyone else.
Okay, so the Finns did not actually lose income. It's just that everyone else was gaining. And so they were losing, like in relative terms, they were losing out. Why did they not gain? I do not know. They were, small in number. They were located mostly in the upper Midwest. They were very concentrated in the railroad industry, working on sort of like movable jobs that they're on the railroad and they're working as like low-level, engineers, so to speak. And it just may have something to do with that industry. But it's a very small number, so we never looked in detail at that case. Thanks. It's a really good point, and it often comes up.
It's a striking bar, but it's just not a lot of people.
It's not a lot of people.
So, Harold James, thank you so much. It's a really great project. Two questions. One about your conclusions on the way in which the national debate shifted in the years after the Second World War. And you give a very kind of ideas-driven or politics-driven explanation of that. But you could also, I think, say that this was in the aftermath of an unprecedented growth in productivity, and then in the middle of a really big growth period for the American economy. And so in that sense, the economic circumstances, and the lesson could be what you need to do in order to change the climate is really to get more productivity in the first place, and then in the aftermath of that, more growth. And then I had a second question, which is kind of like the specific country, because everybody is going to think of one country jumping out at us, and you can hear me talking with what's still a British accent. The UK looks very peculiar in the modern period in that this is the one country where the people come in very rich, and they look very good. And then the next generation, the 2010 generation, have this really unique fall. And, so yes, I mean, this probably describes my children.
The Finns of the 21st century,
But I also wondered about it. I mean, there must be a very interesting kind of set of explanations for this. And, in one way, you've got a linguistic element here, because this is one of the very few countries, Ireland as well, where you don't have a linguistic problem coming to the United States. And so there's no question, there's no need to learn a foreign language. We don't need to exert ourselves. We can talk the language and so on, and we're just fine. And so, we would think we would have advantages, but your data shows very substantial disadvantages. And I wondered whether you had a neat hypothesis on that one.
I do not have a hypothesis about the children of immigrants from the UK, nor about the Finns. So I will have to just take a pass on that one, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts as someone who has such children. But on your first point, I mean, that's a fascinating hypothesis about why attitudes towards immigrants change so rapidly. What I thought you were going to say is the role of fighting in World War II alongside the immigrants and the children of immigrants. Maybe the intermixing that happened and the experience of meeting your fellow Americans who you may not have met before. So I'm going to add the productivity hypothesis to our list. Right now, what we've done is we've produced that time series with a set of computational linguists, and we've finished that first descriptive part of the project. But what we now want to do is start to look into what explains that rapid improvement in attitudes. And we, of course, have data for all of the individual senators and congresspeople. Those who've spoken about immigration enough times where we feel like we have confidence that we can measure their attitudes at the individual representative level, we can then connect that to aspects of their local electorate. So when you're talking about productivity gains after World War II, yes, that was broadly shared, but not everywhere to the same degree. So we could take a look at a hypothesis like this one, and we're very much looking forward to doing that. Any political scientists in the audience today who want to talk to me about something like that, I would love to talk and collaborate, because we have all the data and we're looking to.
So I feel like when I was in school, what I was taught was that hard-seller reform was a sort of second-order consequence of the civil rights movement. That there was obviously a lot of activism around civil rights in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and that kind of was pushed over into the immigration context. But then I've heard that story complicated, that even though the impact of those reforms was really to create more immigration from Asia, that the intent was to have more immigration from to bring back the Italians, essentially. And then for whatever, that didn't happen.
Right. The politicians at the time said, don't worry, even though we're opening the border again in 1965, we are not going to see an influx of immigrants from other countries. Why? Because we are going to take away the country-specific quotas that had been put in place in the 1920s, and we're going to replace them with primarily family reunification-based visas. And so when you think about who's living in the country, who could take advantage of the 1965 law, they were thinking mostly about the Portuguese, the Greeks, the other sort of Southern Europeans who had started their inflows in the 20s. That had been cut off, but now they still had elderly uncles that could send for family members, and that's who they thought would come to the country. And they turned out to be wrong, but there was no way in which the politicians at the time kind of foresaw how the 1965 Act would change the graphics of inflows. Certainly the Act passed in 65 as part of a civil rights era, but there was a lot of groundwork that was being laid before.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious, do you think that, I'm curious what you think the data would look like in other countries. In other words, do you think this is a story about immigrants in general, or a story about immigrants in the United States? And if you think that this is unique to the United States, what about our culture, economics, or society make that happen?
Well, people are just starting to answer that question. I mean, as you can see, you need tremendous amount of data to be able to link parents to children. And so the one thing I wish we would add more in Streets of Gold is a comparison across different countries. But that research is really just getting off the ground. From what we can see, it looks like very similar patterns in Canada and Australia. Mm-hmm. So those are like historically immigrant receiving areas. And it looks like different patterns in the UK and France and Germany. But that might be somewhat outdated. That's a study from around 8-9 years ago, and there's new work being done. So I really think jury is out, but at the moment, that's the way that the evidence is starting to line up, is that it really matters, are you a historical immigrant receiving country, or have you always been an immigrant sending area and only recently an immigrant receiving area? And so if that's true, then we need to understand, like, what is it about being an immigrant receiving area that matters? Like, what are the institutions that really matter? Is it something about public schools, neighborhoods, churches? We're starting to think that through, but I don't have a good answer.
Are you actively pursuing that? I mean, are there countries where don't we usually go to like Sweden for really good data on stuff?
Well, we are not pursuing that, but other teams of researchers are, and there's a lot of good work that's being done right now. Sort of at the same time as we were doing our work. I wouldn't say replicating our work, but very similar to what we do. So we should know soon.
Another British immigrant. I thought the talk was admirable. 75% of Americans believe that immigration is good. And I think the immigrants themselves would think it was good. That's where they're coming. Why is it that Congress does not pass a bill so that legal immigration could be increased by 2 or 3 million, perhaps more, so that everybody that wants to come can come and come legally, and all of this arguing, going backwards and forwards, hurting the country and hurting the immigrants would go away?
So an easy answer is just polarization. You can see that attitudes differ by political party. It's hard to get bipartisan consensus. The last time that we had an attempt at comprehensive immigration reform in 2013, there was the Gang of Eight with the 4 Democratic, 4 Republican senators that came together. Those senators are either now no longer with us or have very much changed their tune on immigration. So things might seem hopeless. And you might want to point fingers at Republicans. But one thing that I think we really need to take on board is, what is the role of Democratic strategy here? Comprehensive immigration reform means rolling together all of the different elements of immigration policy into one package. Some of those are very popular, some of those are less popular. So for example, DACA is popular, providing a pathway to citizenship for children who arrived undocumented, but general amnesty is not popular. For example, reforming H-1B visas to allow more high-skilled immigration is popular. But Democrats know that in order to get the full suite of reforms, they need to put them all together, the loved with the unloved. But could we make progress on some of those popular provisions? Yes. Even now, I believe, and Matt knows more about the political landscape than I do, but even now I believe that we have bipartisan will for some of the popular elements. And it's a strategy, and it might be holding reform hostage.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in Obama's second term, if Democrats had wanted to expand skilled legal immigration, they could have said yes to that, but chose to say no because they thought they were going to get a much larger immigration reform. And to be fair, I mean, they almost did. I mean, when things happen, they start to look inevitable in retrospect. But at the time, it seemed very close to a deal passing. It passed the Senate with a huge majority. It had majority support in the House. There was a move to make John Boehner bring it to the floor. Eric Cantor lost a primary for centric reasons, and things broke a whole other way. And after that, I mean, I think Democrats just became like busted by the topic and didn't want to deal with it anymore. But to the point of the gentleman's hypothesis earlier, I mean, I think we are starting to see more and more complaints about lack of workers for things. And Senator Marshall from the Republican side gave a statement just this past week saying, we need to bring back a conversation about legal immigration so that we can fill these roles in agriculture, in Kansas, and other members of their.
So Matt mentioned this hypothesis that immigrants who came in the Ellis Island era did well because immigration was stopped for a long period of time, so there's room. But in looking at this graph of immigration, it looks like there's this sort of 50-year period in which you have fairly high and steady immigration. And I was wondering if you have looked at the how children of immigrants fare when you compare immigrants who arrived at the beginning of this period, whose children or grandchildren might be born within this period where there's a lot of immigration, with the immigrants who arrived at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I did show 2 graphs for the past, one from 1880, kids living at home in 1880 who were then in the labor market in 1910, and one for children living at home in 10 who were then in the labor market in 1940. And so those would be sort of along the lines of what you're saying. The 1910 children, working in their 40s in 1910, that's a labor market that's rife with immigrants, and then the 1940 labor market would have been much restricted. Of course, there are many other differences between those 2 time periods, Great Depression and the war starting and so on, but we don't see, any evidence that it really mattered whether you were in a labor market with many immigrants.
Do you know anything about Asian immigrants from before the Chinese Exclusion Act, things like that?
Well, Nate Hilger has done some work on Asian immigrants from not before the Exclusion Act, but from after 1882. But during this Asian
Okay.
passport. It seems like 1940 is a real turning point. And after 1940, Asian immigrants start to do very well, but before that, they were relatively low upward mobility.
Thanks for the great talk. Excuse me. I was reading a portion of the book last night where you were talking about the differences between children who were born from immigrant families and children born from fathers because of the problems with the last names and trying to track the census. And I immediately thought of my best friend whose mother is an immigrant from Japan, but who married a man who was born in the United States. And so I was wondering if there are any unique data points, crossovers, maybe anything unique about families who are part immigrant and part native.
Well, it's a good question. We did look at it. We can look at it in our data. We can classify you as the child of immigrants based on if your father's an immigrant, based on if your mother's an immigrant, or based on both. In the modern data, we can't, because again, we just get what we get from the IRS. And we didn't see important differences there. There might be particular countries where it matters, like the case of the UK or Finland or whatnot, if we showed you each individual data point, but on average, it doesn't really matter. And I think the reason why is both in the past and today, around 85% of immigrants are married to someone from this. So the majority of the time, we're going to be classifying you this way, whether we look at your mother or your father.
Thank you.
You alluded to this briefly, but I think didn't have a slide on it. But one thing you do see in the modern data is that the sons of sort of Afro-Caribbean immigrants tend to do relatively poorly. But I think you've told me that their daughters do quite a bit better, which suggests some of the maybe like race-gender intersection dynamics.
Yeah, that's incredibly important. And it actually is consistent with Alora's work on the children of the Great Black Migration as well. Black migrants from the US South were able to double their income by leaving the South and moving to industrial cities. But their children did not have as much upward mobility as we would think. And that pattern is especially true for the sons and less so for the daughters. And so Alora thinks Alora thinks that this, likely has something to do with policing, with incarceration, and we think that's probably true as well in our data. That if, let's say, 10% of the kids, the sons from these communities are incarcerated and they're all getting a 0 in income, that's going to bring the average down, but everybody else might be doing okay. The daughters are much less likely to be incarcerated. Just in general, women are much less likely to commit crimes and be arrested and be in jail. And so there's an interesting race and gender intersection there. But I would also point to Nigeria and Dominican Republic, the two other majority Black countries in our data set. And in that case, the sons are also doing very well. Again, it's about IRS rules as to what we can see. And remember, these are kids who were born in the early 80s. So we don't have very many African immigrants, and therefore, by the 1980s, and so as a result, we only had disclosure to present the data for Nigeria.
Right, so just if people don't know, right, so this is anonymized IRS data, and if they give you a sample that's too small, the fear is that you'd be able to identify who the specific individuals are. So only Nigerians had a large population, and that's.
Yeah. So I've heard this idea before that the reason that like a lot of European countries, especially in Western Europe, have been able to develop like a robust welfare state, like a value-added tax, stuff like that, is because they're pretty like ethnically and culturally homogenous, at least over like the last century or so. And like the graph that you showed with kind of the peaks and valleys of immigration got me thinking like the valley of immigration seems to be like negatively correlated with an area in which there's a lot of public support for a robust welfare state. And so I guess to both of you, like, does that seem like fairly causal? And then I guess to Professor Boustan, were you able to kind of suss out the effects of like welfare policy in the success of immigrants? Specifically like welfare policy based in an era like where welfare was more popular because there was less, diversity in the, citizenry.
Well, it's a great hypothesis, and I think it's one that people ought to study in the U.S. We haven't done it, but if you think about the immigration valley from 1920 to 1970, that does coincide with the development of Social Security, and then the birth of Medicare and other parts of our social welfare system. And so I don't think a single time series, is enough to convince us that there's a relationship there, but it's certainly a good start, and I would encourage work on that. I think that it certainly could be part of the story. And as for welfare use and whether that's part of what's going on, it's possible, because remember, these are kids who are being raised in the 80s. By the time we get to the early 90s, there's much more restriction placed on whether immigrants can use welfare. If you're undocumented, no, and if you're legal, then we have to wait 5 years before you can access many aspects of the social welfare system. But that's really a policy change of the early 90s. And so it's possible that welfare plays a role in our period.
In terms of that mid-century switch, right, there's a few different mechanisms you might into. One is, ethnic diversity undermining social solidarity, right? That's like Alcina hypothesis about race and the welfare state in general. The other that Paul Krugman, when he used to be more of an immigration restrictionist, he said that it was a mechanical impact, that a lot of the people in the bottom 25% of the income distribution are foreign born and they can't vote. So it's just a missing electorate for redistribution, right? Or there might be a concern about immigrant use of the welfare state, where I think we know the actual policy change has been substantial. But I once, as an experiment, said we should make a law that says you have to be in the country for 5 years so you can get means-tested social assistance, and it was incredibly popular. People really like this idea, which has been the law for 20 years. Yeah. But nobody knows. Nobody knows that, right? They think that's a great idea.
Right.
And
Well, one small caveat on the voting issue is that actually in the past it was incredibly easy for immigrants to enter the electorate. You could file your first papers for citizenship after 2 years, and then 3 years later you become a citizen. 5-year process. And it's much harder now to go through the citizenship process. So many people wait for a long time with just a green card, or even wait to get the green card before they then can transition to a citizen. So I think that by the time you get to the 20s, there's going to be a lot of immigrants.
This actually reminds me, though, you keep reminding us that your modern immigrant set is people born in which was a while ago at this point. And do you think the ERIRA changes from 1996 that have made it much more difficult for undocumented people to sort of get legal and become citizens, that may have actually changed this trajectory in a negative direction?
I think that's highly possible. So we always talk about Streets of Gold 2.0. Think about why we need to look at kids who were born in the 80s. Those folks are now in their 40s and are at the height of their careers, and so we can pick them up in the data, and we can see and have a good measure of where will they end up in life. We don't want to pick up someone's economic outcomes when they're 25. Because that may not reflect where they'll get. So we need to wait a while in order to get the kids who were born in the mid-90s. And I think it's important that we do that, because the major difference is the 1986 IRCA, which was the mass amnesty program under Ronald Reagan. At the time, there were 3 million undocumented immigrants, and 2.3 million of them received a pathway to citizenship. So almost all of the parents of the kids in our sample had access to a path to citizenship, a work permit originally, and then they could work. The pattern may look very different today, and we need to know that. And so the way we see our results is telling us about what's possible. It's possible for children of poor immigrants from Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, et cetera, to do very well. We don't know if that's what is happening now because it could have changed quite a bit given undocumented families.
Yeah, and what you were saying about Asian immigrants in the pre-1940 period is also, right, it's like if you want to keep people down, like you can do that.
So my question was about something that caught my ear earlier in the talk when you mentioned that in most cases, immigrants don't have a negative impact on U.S.-born workers, but in some cases they do. I was wondering, I'm sure there's an argument there for overall economic benefit from immigration, but how do you respond to people who are mostly concerned strictly with the impact on U.S.-born workers?
It's really a matter of tallying up the costs and benefits. So if we restricted immigration, we're going to restrict the high-skilled immigrants who contribute to science, innovation, entrepreneurship, opening new businesses that create jobs for everyone. If we restrict immigration, those immigrants are not just workers, but they're also consumers. So they're here adding to local demand, which might be that someone is needed in construction to build their house, someone is needed in education to teach their kids, that sort of thing. If we restrict immigration, then we think about workers who work together on teams. Immigrants might specialize in jobs that are not very communication intensive. And then they work with a supervisor or a coworker who is facing the public. Think about a waiter and a busboy in a restaurant. So there's all sorts of ways in which immigrants can add jobs and add work for the US born, and then there's other situations in which they may compete. And so we have to just write down our list of what might happen on the cost side, what might happen on the benefit side, and recognize that there's a little bit of both. Then we have to go look at the data and see what tends to happen. And there's not any one study that's going to convince people that, on balance, immigration does not take away jobs from the US born. But when we look at the preponderance of evidence, that's what the different studies seem.
No, I also think it's always worth saying that this is it's not particular to immigration, that if we like cartelize the Substack industry and said nobody else is able to make a newsletter, like that would benefit me. And then if we did that and we said, well, nobody is allowed to become a plumber, like that would benefit plumbers. But if we went sector by sector doing that, like we'd all end up worse off than we are in a free society where people can choose their occupations. And I think that's a nuance in immigration that, you can maybe try to help people stepwise that way, but you don't normally think of a society as like becoming prosperous, preventing people from starting businesses or.
And I think what you're saying, Matt, is that we need to think about Americans not only as workers, but also as consumers themselves. Mm-hmm. And so all the services that immigrants provide, with immigrants not entering the country, it's not like, okay, those jobs aren't going to go to a US-born worker, wages will go up a little bit, and we'll just employ a US-born worker, for example, picking strawberries in the field, or giving manicures at the local nail salon. What might happen instead is that those services just sort of dry up. When wages get high enough that the firm can't make a profit, then they'll shut down. And so if you can't make a profit picking strawberries by hand, you'll shut down, and maybe you'll use that land to plant a different crop. People will cut their own bushes. They will paint their own nails at home rather than contracting those services in the market. So we need to think about consumers as well as workers.
Right, and that there isn't a fixed, like our houses could just collectively be messier, right? Parents could do less market work because they have childcare. People can have fewer children, right? Like we can always just like make do with less if we don't have workers to provide services, but that would be negative. But do you have any more questions here? Wrap this up. Last thought.
Well, I think we're getting to the end of our time. I always think that an hour and 15 minutes is my attention span rather than an hour and a half. So I thank everyone for being here, for your attendance, for your questions, and for caring about the topics that I cover in Streets of Gold, and for caring about immigration and immigration.
And I am instructed to remind you all that there's going to be book signing and reception down the hall, and you should exit through the lower doors on either side. Thank you all for coming.